How are you doing today? We're getting ready to start on our unit on the New Negro or Harlem Renaissance. First of all, let me talk a little bit about the term. The New Negro or Harlem Renaissance was the literary cultural arm of what is sometimes called the New Negro movement, which was just a political movement that really focused on African Americans' need for self-determination and their desire for civil rights to be granted to them. Okay? And in literary terms, you'll sometimes hear me refer to the movement as the Harlem Renaissance. Other times you might hear me refer to the movement as the New Negro Renaissance. Those terms are interchangeable. They're interchangeable. But as a literary movement, the New Negro Renaissance was an early 20th century modernist literary movement characterized by African American insistence on self-representation. Self-representation is just the desire to represent oneself. As you may know from some of the reading that you've done over the past 2 units, lots of people had lots of things to say about African Americans. This is a renaissance because this is the period when African Americans once again began to dominate who got to say what about them. So it's a very important period in African American literary history, and we're going to focus on that theme of self-representation throughout the entire unit for the next 3 weeks, okay? Let's talk a little bit about dates. Some people date the start of the New Negro Renaissance from 1924, March 21st, 1924 to be exact. There was a Civic Club dinner in New York City that was designed, it was organized by Charles S. Johnson and several other writers, and it was designed to celebrate and promote the work of African American writers. So many people date it from 1924. I don't. I teach what some people have called a long Harlem Renaissance. I say that the Harlem Renaissance spanned from 1916 with the publication of Angelina Wells Grimke's Rachel, which was an anti-lynching play, all the way through 1937 with the publication of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I teach that long Harlem Renaissance, number one, because some of the energies that became a significant part of that movement got their start with that anti-lynching movement that was supported strongly by those club women and other African American women writers that we talked about earlier. And because the novel by Zora Neale Hurston really also helps to capture some of the energies of the Harlem Renaissance. So if we teach that long Harlem Renaissance, we're able to include a lot more significant African American women writers. So I tend to teach that instead of the 1924 date. You just leave out a lot of really important works if you go with the 1924 date. So the dating would be from 1916 to 1937. That's the literary period right there. And as I said, sometimes I'll use the term Harlem Renaissance because that's the most common term. Other times I'll use the term New Negro Renaissance. I prefer New Negro Renaissance because I think it really helps to recognize the geographic diversity of this movement. During this period in African American literary history, you had people contributing not only from Harlem, which is just a section of New York, right? You had African American writers who were active in places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., the West Coast. You even had African American writers establishing communities in places like Paris and Spain. So it is a very geographically diverse movement. So that's in some ways why the term New Negro Renaissance may be more accurate than the Harlem Renaissance term. James Weldon Johnson said in his preface to the book of Negro American Poetry, "No people that has produced great literature and art has ever been looked upon the world as distinctly inferior, and nothing will do more to change the mental attitude and raise his status than a demonstration of intellectual parity of the Negro through the production of literature and art." So one of the really important themes that's captured by that quote is the way that writers during this period saw an explicit connection between the cultural output, that is the artwork, literature, sculpture, you name it, of African Americans, and their political future, So there was an explicit link between the artistic, what we sometimes call the aesthetic, and the political, what we sometimes call the ideological. And so this link was very clear in the minds of many writers, many political thinkers during that period. So that's an important theme that you want to pay attention to as you read the literature in this unit. Another really significant aspect or theme of the Harlem Renaissance / New Negro Renaissance is the turn to Africa. African Americans, by and large, were seen, according to the white supremacist history that dominated during the day, as a people without a history. So very naturally, one of the first things that writers during this period do is to go look for that history, and they find it in Africa. Not only find it in Africa, but also find it in connections with other African people, hence the term Pan-African, what we might call diasporic African connections today. So to keep an eye out for that in the stuff that you're reading. The other thing that happens during this period is a direct reflection of African American history. If you read the period overview from the last unit during the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction movement, this is an era of mass migration of African Americans from the rural South to southern cities and also to cities in other parts of the U.S., especially in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. So the city becomes a significant locale in much of the literature that we're reading for this period, so you want to keep an eye out for that. The other thing that begins to be more celebrated during this period is Black folk traditions. You see that especially in the work of Zora Neale Hurston. And this was the humble, lowly part of African American life, and so there were some people who were ashamed of Black folk traditions, but Zora Neale Hurston, for example, says actually that's one of the richest sites of authentic African American culture. So you begin to see Black folk traditions used as a source and inspiration for African American art. So keep an eye out for that. Popular culture, as was the case in much of the Jazz Age, becomes a significant source for art, especially among African Americans during this period. So you'll see art, for example, the poetry of Langston Hughes, for example. It's heavily influenced by music, popular music, like jazz and the blues. So keep an eye out for that. And then finally, there are two things that you want to keep an eye out for: the issue of patronage and the importance of self-representation, which is the big umbrella thing that I want you to be paying attention to during these units. Patronage was simply the arrangement by which an artist was supported in his or her work, usually by a wealthy patron. This system of producing art goes all the way back to the Renaissance period in European history, right? Where wealthy people or wealthy organizations like the church would provide housing, artistic materials, food, etc. for artists. So African Americans were really bound to that system of patronage, and it did some odd and interesting, not necessarily good things to the art that was produced. For example, among many white patrons, there was an emphasis on primitivism, which was just the idea that Westerners could recapture their authenticity and happiness by really acknowledging some of the primitive parts of human psychology. That goes back to Freud, for example. And so art tended to represent the primitive. So for some of these writers, patrons were interested in seeing only a certain kind of art, an art that celebrated certain parts of African American culture, very frequently the parts that were kind of exciting or arousing in some way. So there was a lot of conflict and tension around that. So you just want to pay attention to that, especially when you get to Hughes and Hurston. We'll talk a little bit more about that. In terms of the specific readings for this week, I've asked you to look at 2 essays, and everything else is poetry. The 2 essays I asked you to look at, one is by Ellen Locke. It's called The New Negro. It's considered the seminal essay. It's a manifesto. It was published in 1925, and for many people it really announced what the movement was all about, who the New Negro was. So you definitely want to read that closely. Locke is interesting in that he focuses on the energy of the New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance. He sees that as being in the city. He sees it as being in the city. But in terms of who was able to capture and harness that energy, he tends to put that in the hands of affluent people of the artistic class, not the people themselves. And that becomes a source of tension during this movement that you want to look out for as we go through these weeks. Africa for Africans was published in 1923. It's by Marcus Garvey, and he was one of those figures who really attempted to connect to the African heritage of African Americans and make it into something new. So that's why that essay is included. I've also asked you to look at several poems. I asked you to look at Claude McKay's If We Must Die. You can really read this poem as an anti-lynching poem if you look at some of the details that are included. But it's an anti-lynching poem in which, instead of having African Americans being represented as hapless victims of racial violence, he represents them as fighting back. That's that new spirit of pride and that idea that African American struggles against racial violence needed to be represented, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a part of the real heroism of African Americans. So that's a deep intervention in how people of color were represented by McKay. McKay is interesting too because he was one of those immigrants. McKay came from the Caribbean, and many of the writers that we talk about as African American writers are from the Caribbean. So you just want to be thinking about how that may have changed the African American perspective on nationhood and on heroism. Okay. The other poem that you read, another poem that you are going to be reading this week, is Jean Toomer's Portrait in Georgia. This is another anti-lynching poem, and it's a spare but really powerful poem that can also be seen as an anti-lynching poem. It's highly visual, and although it apparently focuses on the portraiture tradition of the Southern Belle, that's a white woman who's being represented in that poem, you'll notice that he uses imagery that's associated with lynching to do that. So one of the things he's doing is moving the geographic grounds of his poetry back to the South, which is a significant movement, but also saying that, look, this is really how we need to look at this plantation tradition that you were exposed to during the last 2 units that we did. So there's definitely an intervention there. Instead of celebrating the South, he talks about the South as the site of racial violence. That's what's behind all that white history, okay? I then have you reading 2 poems about heritage. One is by Gwendolyn Bennett, and the other one's by County Cullen. Both of these poems turn on the African-American relationship with Africa. In Bennett's poem, Africa is presented as an antidote to the misrepresentation of African-Americans behind what she calls her sad people's soul hidden by a minstrel's smile. Cullen's poem, though, is a lot more complicated in terms of how it represents the African-American relationship to Africa. You can think about the Cullen poem as an example of double consciousness at work, okay? On the one hand, African Americans have a relationship with Africa, but it's one that's very distant in history. On the other hand, African Americans relate to their history as Westerners, as Americans, and as Christians. So he says there's that poem tends to indicate that there's a lot of tension there. So you want to be looking at that as a poem of double consciousness. You'll notice that he represents that struggle to reconcile those two halves in the same way that Du Bois does. It's represented as heroic, and it's a struggle that's never resolved. So there we get the heroic struggle of African Americans to be Westerners. That's an important intervention in the representation of African Americans. Hughes's Negro Speaks a River is just a beautiful, beautiful little poem. Number one, because of the diction. It's very clean and simple, and that's a little bit different from some of the other stuff that you read where the diction was a register higher, and he does that intentionally. That's very typical of Hughes. It's also beautiful because of its imagery. He represents the voice and history of African Americans by visiting those great rivers that are a part of all of human civilization, and he's basically making the argument in that poem that African Americans have been there for every single major civilization. And maybe that doesn't sound like a lot today because we know more about African American history, but it was a big, bold move to make back when he was writing the poem, because he's essentially saying that not only do African Americans have a history, they have a long-standing history that is as old as human history. So he's claiming a big, big role for African Americans in the history of the world, okay? The last poem that I'm having you look at is Sonnet to a Negro in Harlem. And I'm doing that, having you look at that poem, because she represents the Harlemite, that urban African-American person. It's hard to tell whether this person is a Southern immigrant, but she does mention mangoes and palm trees, so it's possible that this is an immigrant from the Caribbean. But what's important there is the figure in that poem is so aware of their connection to diasporic African culture. And that figure is a proud figure, not ashamed at all of who he or she is, and that figure also rejects materialistic Western values. So again, this is a poem that intervenes in representation of African American identity. Okay, so that's the thing I want you to keep thinking about this week: representation of African American identity. Okay, so you have a fair number of poems to read this week. In the discussion board, I'm really encouraging you to drill down to that issue of representation of African American identity. Your next paper, in fact, is going to be a short paper, will be on this subject. So make sure you do as much work as you can in the discussion board this week to get your thoughts on that sharpened up. Okay? All right. I look forward to seeing what you have to write this week.